Welcome to This Explainer. I'm so glad you're joining me today because we're unpacking something genuinely fascinating and honestly pretty provocative. We're going to be looking at an article by independent analyst Steve Bennett called Occam's Paradox, the Nexus Hypothesis. Now, Bennett takes a sweeping, highly unconventional look at the global response to the COVID-19 pandemic between 2020 and 2023. It's a complex, deeply layered alternative framework. And as always, my goal here isn't to take sides or tell you what to think about a politically charged topic. Instead, we're going to impartially deconstruct Bennett's arguments step by step so we can understand exactly how he builds this hypothesis.
Okay, let's dive right into the core premise, the Nexus Hypothesis. Bennett proposes that the events of the pandemic weren't just a series of isolated, disjointed policy fumbles or contentious health measures. Rather, he defines the whole thing as a coordinated, multi-domain operation. According to his article, this operation leveraged a global public health crisis to accelerate a pre-existing agenda of social control and economic centralization by a network that he calls the Nexus.
To understand how he builds this case, here is our roadmap. First, the Nexus hypothesis itself. Second, the preparatory and initiation phases. Third, execution across four fronts. Fourth, explaining Occam's paradox. And finally, a call for investigation. Let's get to it.
Section 1. The Nexus Hypothesis, Blueprinting a Global Response.
Bennett's central argument is that, quote, the events are best understood as integrated components of a coordinated operation executed by a transnational network. What he's doing here is distinctly moving away from trying to prove some singular smoky room conspiracy. Instead, he relies on the alignment of incentives, capabilities, and actions across multiple domains. He argues that when you take virology, economics, information science, and politics and look at them together, they suggest a common strategic purpose.
Moving to Section 2, Preparatory and Initiation Phases, Setting the Stage.
Bennett points out some really incredible synchronicities starting back in late 2019. First, in October, you had Event 201, a tabletop exercise simulating a global coronavirus pandemic, which he notes focused heavily on managing information and combating misinformation. That exact same month, the Military World Games took place in Wuhan, China. He identifies that as a highly efficient potential vector for global dispersal, noting reports of athletes falling ill. Fast forward to the summer of 2020, and a group called the Transition Integrity Project ran war games simulating a contested U.S. election. Bennett argues these weren't coincidences. They were cohesive preparatory sequences, literal blueprints for crisis management and electoral control.
As for the trigger, Bennett points directly to the Wuhan Institute of Virology. He impartially notes that this facility was a primary site for U.S.-funded gain-of-function research on bat coronaviruses. Because they were engineering these viruses to enhance infectivity in humanized models, Bennett argues the inherent risks make a lab-associated origin a highly plausible initiation point for this alleged operation.
Section 3. Execution across four fronts, the multi-domain exploitation.
According to the author, the execution of this plan happens simultaneously across four specific sectors: public health, information, economic, and political. Bennett argues that manipulating these four fronts at the exact same time was the central mechanism used to secure social control and centralize power.
Let's start with the public health front. Bennett makes a pretty striking claim here. He points out that by late 2021, the medical reasoning for vaccine mandates had significantly weakened. Efficacy against transmission was dropping, and the infection fatality rate was low. Yet mandates were enforced with unprecedented severity. Why? Well, he argues the policy functioned less as viral mitigation and more as a demographic purge, a social filter, if you will, to identify and penalize a specific socio-political profile of people who valued civil liberties and inherently had low institutional trust.
And this filtering mechanism was heavily protected by the information front. The article details the rise of what it calls a censorship industrial complex. Bennett points to formal public-private partnerships, specifically citing groups like the Stanford Internet Observatory collaborating with the Department of Homeland Security's CISA. According to the text, this massive apparatus was deployed to systematically flag and suppress online content, effectively silencing dissent on vaccine efficacy and electoral integrity, and to sharply eliminating public debate.
80%. That is a massive, unprecedented figure. It represents the staggering expansion of the U.S. M1 money supply between January 2020 and late 2021, and it is the absolute foundation of Bennett's next point.
On the economic front, Bennett argues that this 80% expansion of liquidity was pumped primarily into financial markets. It inflated asset prices for the wealthiest decile, executing what he calls a great wealth transfer. At the same time, the resulting inflation on essential goods acted as a brutal, regressive tax on the working and middle class. Basically, it disproportionately harmed the exact same demographics that were being targeted by the health mandates.
Finally, we have the political front. The article claims that pandemic conditions provided the perfect pretext for a hasty, nationwide shift in U.S. election procedures. Bennett points to mass mail-in voting, weakened signature verification, and the injection of hundreds of millions of dollars from private entities, like the so-called Zuckerbucks, straight into local election offices. He argues this created significant inequities and direct opportunities for electoral manipulation.
Section 4. Explaining Occam's paradox. Beyond the simplest answer. Now, you might be familiar with Occam's razor, right? The idea that all things being equal, you should prefer the simplest explanation. But here, Bennett introduces his own conceptual model, Occam's paradox. He argues that over-relying on isolated, simple explanations for every independent event actually completely fails when you look at the totality of a complex phenomenon.
As Bennett writes, the greater the number of independent Occam's razor explanations required to explain a phenomenon, the weaker each of their explanatory value becomes. He's drawing pretty heavily on statistical inference here. Essentially, if you have to chalk up the simulation exercises, the virus origin, the censorship, the wealth transfer, and the election changes all up to mere coincidence, incompetence, or independent policy failures, you are actually making massive leaps of faith. To Bennett, his nexus hypothesis is mathematically and logically way more sound than believing in a cascade of completely unrelated coincidences.
To back this up, Bennett highlights specific anomalies that conventional theories just tend to ignore. Why did public health mandates outlast their medical rationale? Why was there a synchronized expansion of censorship right when monetary policy was shifting? Why did institutions refuse to actively measure the real economic damage of lockdowns? And why was there a disproportionate targeting of a specific demographic? Bennett argues the nexus hypothesis answers all of these coherently under a single, unified operational framework.
Section 5. A call for investigation, moving from hypothesis to theory.
The article concludes with a really firm call to action for the academic and investigative communities. Bennett insists this framework must be empirically validated through rigorous, transparent audits across 4 specific areas. First, in virology. He demands full access to Wuhan Institute records. Second, data analysis, requiring independent statistical reanalysis of health databases like VAERS. Third, economics, calling for deep forensic audits of central bank flows and private election funds. And fourth, law and policy, demanding congressional discovery into the exact communications between government agencies and tech platforms that fueled the censorship apparatus.
Which leaves us with this genuinely provocative thought. When a crisis completely reshapes society, how do we actually distinguish between coordinated exploitation and just a cascade of coincidences? Steve Bennett's nexus hypothesis challenges us to look at the big picture and really question the overlapping systems of power around us. Whether you agree with his conclusions or not, it for sure forces us to think critically about the information landscape we navigate every single day. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. Keep questioning, keep learning, and keep looking closely at the data.